Children, settle down. I expect your full attention. We will begin our lesson now. No talking.
In the autumn of 1917, when the world was drowning in the chaos of war and communities clung to order like a lifeline, a schoolteacher in rural Pennsylvania gathered her students for their annual photograph. The children stood in 3 neat rows against the weathered brick wall of Oak Ridge Elementary, their faces frozen in the solemn stillness that early cameras demanded. Boys in wool knickers and suspenders, girls in starched pinafores with ribbons carefully tied, all of them instructed not to move, not to breathe, not to exist as children for the 30 seconds it took for light to burn their images onto glass. The teacher, Miss Harriet Caldwell, stood at the left edge of the frame, her hand resting on the shoulder of the smallest child, her expression as rigid as the iron rules she enforced in her classroom. This photograph, like thousands of others taken in schoolyards across America that year, should have been nothing more than a quiet document of childhood, a moment preserved and then forgotten in the slow march of time. But this photograph refused to stay quiet. For over a century, it lay buried in the basement archives of the County Historical Society, filed away in a crumbling leather portfolio marked only with the year and the school's name. When a volunteer archivist named Claire Dennison stumbled upon it in the winter of 2019, she almost dismissed it entirely. Another class photo, another collection of stern faces and period clothing, another artifact of an America that no longer existed. She set it aside with dozens of others, planning to catalog it later, to assign it a reference number and return it to the darkness from which it had emerged. But something pulled her back. That evening, as she prepared to lock the archive room, she found herself standing before the photograph again, her fingers hovering over the glass that protected it. There was something in the arrangement of the children, something in the way they stood, that felt wrong in a way she could not name. Claire photographed the image with her phone and posted it to a historical photography forum, asking if anyone else noticed anything unusual. Within hours, the responses began flooding in. People from across the country, many of them strangers to both Claire and each other, reported the same visceral discomfort. They could not stop looking at one child in particular, a boy standing in the second row, 3 positions from the right. His face was unremarkable, his clothing identical to the others, his posture perfectly still. Yet dozens of viewers insisted that something about him felt profoundly out of place, as though he existed in a different dimension than the children surrounding him. Some claimed his expression seemed too knowing, too old for his apparent age. Others pointed to the way light fell across his features, creating shadows that did not match the ambient illumination in the rest of the photograph. A few simply said they felt watched, that his eyes seemed to follow them no matter which angle they viewed the image from. The attention spread beyond the forum. Paranormal enthusiasts declared the child a ghost, a spirit accidentally captured on film. Skeptics dismissed the whole affair as mass hysteria, the human brain's tendency to find patterns and meaning in randomness. But Claire felt none of this explained the genuine unease she experienced each time she looked at the boy. She decided to do what historians do best. She would find the facts, the records, the names that would transform this collection of faces into real children with real lives. She would identify every person in the photograph, and in doing so, she would prove or disprove the strange feeling that had taken hold of so many people. She would give the boy a name, and names, she believed, had the power to dispel any mystery. The Oak Ridge Elementary enrollment records for 1917 were stored in the same archive, bound in heavy ledgers with marbled covers and pages that crackled like dead leaves when turned. Claire spent weeks cross-referencing the names with census data, birth certificates, and family genealogies maintained by local historical societies. One by one, the children in the photograph revealed themselves. Margaret Fulton, standing in the front row with a white bow in her hair, daughter of the town banker. Thomas Weaver, the tall boy at the back whose father owned the grain mill. Sarah Pritchard, Emma Chen, Jacob Holloway, Ruth Morrison, each name connected to a family, a home, a story that continued beyond the borders of the frame. Claire contacted descendants when she could find them, sent letters and emails asking if they possessed family records or photographs that might confirm the identities she had pieced together. The responses came slowly but steadily, and with each confirmation, the photograph became less mysterious and more human. Except for one child. The boy who had triggered such unease remained unnamed. Claire checked and rechecked her records, counted the children in the photograph against the enrollment list, searched for discrepancies in the dates. According to Miss Caldwell's meticulous attendance records, 23 children were enrolled in the combined 3rd and 4th grade class in October 1917, the month the photograph was taken. Claire had identified 23 children in the image. The numbers matched perfectly. Yet when she listed the confirmed names and compared them to the enrollment ledger, every child was accounted for except the boy in the second row. His face matched no name she had left. She wondered if perhaps she had made an error, confused one child for another. But no matter how many times she reviewed her research, the conclusion remained the same. There were 23 children in the enrollment records, 23 children in the photograph, but only 22 names that aligned. Frustrated and increasingly obsessed, Claire expanded her search. She examined school board meeting minutes, teacher contracts, and disciplinary reports. She reviewed local newspaper archives for any mention of Oak Ridge Elementary in 1917, searching for stories about students or families that might provide a clue. She found advertisements for school supplies, notices about holiday programs, and brief mentions of patriotic rallies held in the schoolyard to support the war effort. But she found nothing that explained the unnamed boy. In desperation, she began reaching out to elderly residents of the county, people whose grandparents had attended Oak Ridge or lived in the community during that time. She visited nursing homes and senior centers, carrying a printed copy of the photograph, asking the same questions over and over. Do you recognize anyone in this picture? Did your parents or grandparents ever mention anything unusual about the school? Have you heard any stories about children who attended Oak Ridge in 1917? Most people offered polite but unhelpful responses. A few shared general memories passed down through families, stories about harsh winters and difficult harvests, about boys leaving school early to work on farms and girls being kept home to care for younger siblings. But when Claire pointed to the unnamed boy, something shifted. She noticed it first with an 87-year-old woman named Dorothy Keene, whose grandmother had been Margaret Fulton, the girl with the white bow. Dorothy studied the photograph for a long moment, her finger tracing the rows of children, and when she reached the boy, her hand stopped. She looked up at Claire with an expression that was not quite fear but something close to it, something that lived in the territory between confusion and recognition. She said her grandmother had never talked about that year of school, that whenever anyone asked about childhood memories, Margaret would speak about other times, other grades, but never about 1917. Dorothy had always assumed it was because of the war, because so many families in the community had lost sons in Europe and the sadness had touched everyone. But now, looking at the photograph, Dorothy wondered if there had been another reason for her grandmother's silence. This pattern repeated itself with disturbing consistency. Claire interviewed 11 people whose relatives appeared in the photograph, and 7 of them reported similar gaps in family memory. Their ancestors had attended Oak Ridge Elementary, had lived full lives in the community, but had maintained a peculiar silence about that specific year, that specific class. When pressed, some would change the subject. Others would claim they simply did not remember. A few became visibly uncomfortable, as though Claire had touched upon something shameful or frightening that had been deliberately buried. One man, the grandson of Thomas Weaver, told Claire that his grandfather had once mentioned that children sometimes disappeared in those days, that families moved away without warning or children were sent to live with relatives, and that it was considered rude to ask too many questions about such matters. But when Claire asked if his grandfather had been referring to someone specific, the man closed down entirely, said he did not want to discuss it further, and asked her to leave. The silence itself became evidence. Claire began to understand that she was not searching for a name that had been accidentally omitted or a record that had been misfiled. She was searching for a name that had been deliberately erased, a child who had been systematically removed from collective memory. But why would an entire community choose to forget a student? What could a child have done, or what could have been done to a child, that would require such thorough erasure? Claire realized she needed to understand not just the photograph, but the world in which it was taken. She needed to step back into 1917, into the fears and pressures that shaped that community, and understand what schools represented in that moment of American history. The autumn of 1917 was a time of paranoia and rigid control. The United States had entered the Great War 6 months earlier, and communities across the country were consumed with demonstrating loyalty and rooting out anything that seemed foreign or subversive. Schools became battlegrounds for Americanization, places where immigrant children were taught to shed their parents' languages and customs, where patriotism was enforced with the same severity as mathematics and penmanship. Teachers were expected to identify students whose families might harbor sympathies for Germany or other enemy nations. Children were taught to report on their parents, to watch for signs of disloyalty, to understand that conformity was not just expected but required for survival. In rural Pennsylvania, where German immigrant communities had thrived for generations, the pressure was particularly intense. Families anglicized their names, stopped speaking German in public, burned letters and photographs that connected them to the old country. Schools conducted flag salutes and loyalty pledges with religious fervor, and any child who seemed different, who did not participate with sufficient enthusiasm, could become the target of suspicion. But the war was not the only source of anxiety. The progressive era had brought with it a new emphasis on social order and scientific management, including the belief that society could be improved through careful control of its most vulnerable members. Orphanages, reformatories, and institutions for the feeble-minded expanded rapidly during this period, filled with children deemed unfit for normal society. Schools were tasked with identifying these children, with separating the promising from the problematic. Teachers kept detailed records of behavior, intelligence, and moral character, and children who fell short of expectations could be removed from regular classrooms and sent to facilities where they would be hidden from public view. The criteria for removal were often arbitrary and cruel, based on poverty, disability, ethnicity, or simply a personality that did not conform to rigid standards of obedience. These children were not criminals, but they were treated as problems to be solved, and the solution was often invisibility. In this context, Claire began to understand how a child could vanish from a school photograph without anyone asking questions. If the boy had been categorized as unfit, if he had been removed from the community and sent to an institution, the school and the families might have collectively decided that it was easier to forget him than to acknowledge what had been done. The shame would not have been his alone, but would have stained everyone who participated in or permitted his removal. And so the silence would have become protective, a way for the community to move forward without confronting its complicity. But this theory, while plausible, did not explain the photograph itself. If the boy had been removed before the picture was taken, he would not appear in the frame. If he had been removed afterward, there would be no reason to erase his name from the records. Unless the photograph itself was part of the erasure, unless there was something about his presence in the image that the community found intolerable. Claire ordered a high-resolution digital scan of the original photograph, hoping that modern technology might reveal details invisible to the naked eye or to viewers in 1917. When the files arrived, she spent hours examining every pixel, zooming in on faces and hands and the spaces between bodies. She studied the way light fell across the scene, the depth of shadows, the sharpness of focus. And slowly, she began to notice inconsistencies that should not have existed. The children in the photograph were standing on a gravel courtyard, and their feet cast shadows that generally pointed in the same direction, consistent with a single light source, presumably the sun at a particular angle. But the unnamed boy's shadow was different. It fell at a slightly different angle, as though he were standing in a different time of day or illuminated by a different light. His shoes, too, seemed wrong. While the other children wore sturdy leather boots or simple canvas shoes appropriate for farm children in 1917, his footwear appeared lighter, less defined, almost ghostly in its lack of detail. She examined his hands, which hung at his sides in a posture similar to several other children. But while the other children's hands showed the slight blur of involuntary movement during the long exposure, his hands were perfectly sharp, frozen in a way that suggested complete stillness or something else entirely. His face, too, possessed a clarity that did not match the faces around him. Early photographs required subjects to remain motionless for extended periods, and even the most disciplined children would show some softness in their features, some evidence of breathing or micromovements. But the boy's face had a crystalline quality, as though it had been captured in a different way or at a different time. Claire consulted with experts in historical photography, showing them the scan and asking if they noticed anything unusual about the technical aspects of the image. Two professors independently pointed out the same detail. The boy appeared to have been added to the photograph after the fact, inserted into the frame through a technique called composite printing. Composite photography was not uncommon in the early 20th century. Studios would sometimes combine multiple negatives to create idealized family portraits or to include absent members in group photographs. But the practice was expensive and required significant skill, and it was rarely used for ordinary school pictures. If someone had gone to the trouble and expense of adding the boy to the photograph after it was taken, there had to be a reason. Claire began searching for that reason in the places where uncomfortable truths are often buried. In court records, in asylum admissions, in the terse, bureaucratic language of death certificates. She requested documents from the county courthouse, from state hospitals, from the archives of institutions that had once housed unwanted children. The process was slow and often frustrating, as many records from that era had been lost or destroyed, and those that remained were poorly indexed and difficult to access. Months passed. Claire's obsession with the photograph began to affect her personal life, her work, her sleep. She dreamed about the boy, about his face staring out at her from the frame, about his shadow falling at the wrong angle. She imagined scenarios that might explain his presence, stories of tragedy and guilt that grew more elaborate and disturbing with each iteration. And then, on a cold morning in March, she found a document that changed everything. It was a coroner's report, filed in November 1917, describing the death of a male child approximately 8 years old, found on the property of Oak Ridge Elementary School. The cause of death was listed as accidental, the result of a fall from a second-story window. The child's name was recorded as unknown, and there was a notation that the body had been claimed by the county for burial. Attached to the report was a brief statement from Miss Harriet Caldwell, the teacher, explaining that the child had been climbing where he should not have been, that she had warned him repeatedly about the danger, and that his death, while tragic, was the result of his own disobedience. Claire felt her hands shaking as she read the document. Here, finally, was evidence of a child who had died at the school, a death that had been classified as accidental and quickly resolved. But why was the child's name unknown? Surely the teacher would have known which of her students had died. Surely there would have been a family to notify, a funeral to arrange, records to complete. Unless the child had not been a regular student, or unless his presence at the school had been unofficial, or unless there was a reason to obscure his identity. Claire pulled the enrollment ledger again and counted the names, counted the dates of attendance. Every student was accounted for throughout the autumn of 1917. No one had withdrawn, no one had died, no one had disappeared, which meant the child who fell from the window had never been enrolled, had never officially existed as a student at Oak Ridge Elementary. She returned to the newspaper archives with new urgency, searching not for mentions of the school but for any reports of a child's death in November 1917. She found nothing. No obituary, no funeral notice, no brief mention of an accident. The death that appeared in official court records had been completely absent from the local newspaper, as though the community had collectively agreed not to acknowledge it. Claire began to construct a theory, one that made her sick with its implications but that fit the evidence she had gathered. A child had been at the school, perhaps living there, perhaps hidden there, for reasons that were not documented. This child had died in a fall that may or may not have been accidental. The teacher, Miss Caldwell, had reported the death as the result of the child's disobedience, shifting responsibility away from herself and the school. And then, in an act that Claire could only interpret as guilt or desperation, someone had added the child to the class photograph, had inserted his image into the frame as though he had been a regular student, as though he had belonged. But why would anyone do such a thing? Claire found a partial answer in another document, this one from the State Board of Education. In 1918, Oak Ridge Elementary had been investigated following an anonymous complaint about inadequate supervision and unsafe conditions. The investigation had been brief and inconclusive, but it had resulted in a recommendation that the school improve its safety protocols and that Miss Caldwell receive additional training in student welfare. The report made no mention of the child's death, but the timing was suggestive. If parents or community members had begun asking questions about what had happened, if there had been whispers about negligence or abuse, the school board might have felt pressure to demonstrate that everything had been normal, that all students had been properly documented and cared for. The photograph, with the boy inserted into the frame, could have served as evidence that he had been a regular student, that his presence at the school had been legitimate and supervised. Claire tracked down land records and discovered that Miss Caldwell had owned a small house adjacent to the school property, and that she had lived there alone except for a brief period in 1917 when records indicated a second occupant, listed only as a ward. The details were vague, but they suggested that Miss Caldwell had been caring for a child who was not her own, perhaps a relative's child or an informal foster arrangement common in that era. If that child had died while in her care, she would have faced not only personal grief but also potential legal and professional consequences. By adding him to the school photograph and then erasing his name from memory, she might have believed she was protecting herself, protecting the school, perhaps even protecting the child's dignity by giving him a place among his peers, even if only in a photograph. The community had gone along with this erasure, Claire believed, because it was easier than confronting the truth. In 1917, authority figures like teachers were rarely questioned, and the death of a child, especially one who existed on the margins of official documentation, might have seemed like a private tragedy rather than a public concern. The families whose children appeared in the photograph would have known, or suspected, what had happened, but speaking about it would have meant acknowledging that they had allowed a child to suffer and die in their midst without intervention. Silence became complicity, and complicity became a shared burden that the entire community carried into the next generation. The descendants who refused to talk to Claire were not protecting a specific secret but rather honoring an inherited command to forget, to let the past remain buried. But the past, as Claire had learned, does not stay buried when someone is determined to unearth it. She compiled her research into a detailed report and presented it to the County Historical Society. Some members were skeptical, uncomfortable with the implications of her findings. Others praised her thoroughness and argued that the boy, whoever he had been, deserved to be remembered rather than erased. The society voted to create a new display about Oak Ridge Elementary, one that would include the photograph along with the full story of Claire's investigation. They commissioned a marker to be placed at the site of the old school, which had been demolished decades earlier, acknowledging the child who had died there in 1917. They did not have a name to put on the marker, so they chose words that felt appropriate. In memory of the child who was forgotten, and who we now remember. Claire attended the dedication ceremony on a bright afternoon in May, standing among a small crowd of local residents and historical society members. As she looked at the marker, at the words carved into stone, she thought about the power of erasure and the equal power of recovery. For over a century, the community had successfully hidden the boy's existence, had removed him from records and memory with ruthless efficiency. But they had made one mistake. They had put him in the photograph. Whether it was guilt or denial or some misguided attempt at redemption, that act of insertion had preserved his image, had kept him visible even when his name was lost. And because of that single photograph, because of the unease it provoked in viewers who could sense that something was wrong, the boy had finally found his way back into history. The photograph now hangs in the County Historical Society, properly labeled and contextualized. Visitors still report feeling unsettled by the unnamed boy, by the way his shadow falls at the wrong angle, and his face possesses a clarity that defies the limitations of early photography. But now they understand that their unease is not irrational, that it is a response to a truth the photograph both reveals and conceals. The boy does not belong in the image because he was not truly part of the class, not in the way the other children were. He was added later, inserted into a scene he never inhabited in life, placed among peers who stood beside him only in this artificial arrangement. He is a ghost, not in the supernatural sense but in the historical sense, a person who was deliberately removed from the record and who haunts us precisely because of that removal. The investigation did not give the boy his name, and Claire has accepted that she may never discover it. Records from that era are incomplete, and the people who knew the truth are long dead. But she gave him something perhaps more important. She gave him a story, a context, a reason for existing in that photograph. She transformed him from an object of vague discomfort into a subject worthy of attention and compassion. She demonstrated that forgetting is not inevitable, that even the most determined erasure can be undone if someone cares enough to look closely, to ask difficult questions, to refuse the comforting lie of silence. The boy in the photograph is still unnamed, but he is no longer unknown. He stands in that second row, 3 positions from the right, and he will continue to stand there for as long as people are willing to see him, to acknowledge his presence, to resist the temptation to look away. Some children were never meant to disappear.